Guys, our boat is falling apart. Well, we are sailing into Olbia this morning. We've been on anchor out here for a couple of days and just enjoying this beautiful sunshine, which is kind of weird for the middle of the winter, but we've been enjoying it nonetheless. And we've got all three with us. There's zero tide, we've got the wind behind us, and it's daylight, so we're having a great little sail down the channel.
Steady.
And we made it. Stern tied and everything. Good job. Good job, the hands clean. Yeah. Slime lines are called slime lines for a reason.
It's so nasty.
Yeah, stern in because the wind was blowing us that way and we're only going to be here for a few days and it's a completely empty marina, so we don't really worry too much about privacy or whatever. So yeah, it worked out pretty good. Now we get to start figuring out everything we need to do while we're here. All right, let me explain. Do you guys remember in those very, very first episodes when we first got Uma and the keel was wobbling and our hearts sunk? And then we made the plan to rip everything out of the inside, re-glass the floors and the structure that holds the keel on, and then sort of put everything back. In the very beginning, our budget was limited, our experience was limited, our knowledge were limited, our tools was limited. Let's just say we did the best we could. But if you remember those first renovations, we were doing them on the water, hardly any power, hand tools. It was mostly paint and duct tape and caulking and zip ties. And it worked okay. I mean, the boat lasted through the Caribbean. We've obviously upgraded and modified things along the way. However, there's been one major structural flaw in our boat since those very early days. And we've been pushing it back and pushing it back and pushing it back on the priority list because it's such a big project that we've always questioned whether or not it was even worth doing to our boat, because at some point there comes a time where you're spending more money than the boat is worth. And we've been going back and forth on that decision since the very beginning. So some of you guys have noticed the problem and have even commented on it. And it's actually been there since the very beginning, since we very first splashed Uma and we retightened the rig. And it's those dimples that we have in the side of the hull. Some of you think maybe we got hit or we have a steel boat. Like, the comments continually roll in because they've always been there, but because our boat is old and the gel coat is matte, they kind of only show up when the lighting's just right. But all this heavy weather sailing we've been doing and crossing the North Atlantic and going up above the Arctic Circle in the snow, in the cold, and all the sailing that we've been doing have over the years made them a little bit bigger. So why are those dimples here? Well, when we ground out all of the structure in our boat at the very beginning, the yard decided they needed to move our boat halfway through that project. And so they lifted our boat up without any structural support holding the keel on. And then when they set us back down, they just sort of eyeballed where our boat was supposed to be. And the hull deformed ever so slightly. But because we don't have a super rigid, blue water boat that's super duper reinforced hull, our hull flexes quite a bit. It's a production boat. It's a classic plastic. It's not one of those super thick bomb-proof boats. So when we glassed all that structure back into the boat, and then glassed all the bulkheads, and then put the boat in the water, then tightened up our rig, the hull shape had changed just enough that when we tightened the rig, that angle had shifted a little bit. So we've always known what the problem was from the beginning, and we had a general understanding of what it was going to take to fix it, but it's such a big problem and it's so much work that we've just been procrastinating doing it. So a little bit of explanation. Sailboats have masts. Masts have standing rigging that keep the mast up. So our sailboat that only has one spreader means that we have 3 shrouds coming down each side of the mast. The upper, which comes down from the very top of the mast to the main bulkhead behind me, and then the forward lower and the aft lower. Those ones come down to these little triangle support sections in the boat that are called knees. And that is where those dimples are, because the forward lowers and the aft lowers have pulled in the hull just a little bit. Behind this insulation, right where this knee connects to the hull, it's ripped off and it's delaminated a little bit because it was never really fiberglassed well to the hull to begin with. So it was a weakest point, and that was the first point to give. In our gear locker here and in the head, these knees are exposed and they're relatively easy to access. So those aren't going to be the problem. It's these aft ones that have always been the issue, because it's kind of a big snowball project. In order to reinforce these aft knees, we need to remove everything from the hull, all of this cabinetry that we built in, so that we can extend this knee down the hull and reinforce it properly. But if we're doing all that work, we may as well rip out our old fiberglass water tanks and remake those, because they're 50-year-old fiberglass water tanks and it's probably not good for us to be drinking out of them. If we're going to be ripping the water tanks out, it means we're ripping all of the nook and settee back out. Because when we originally did that repair in our boat, in the keel, and we put the cabin sole back in, we sort of just set it down. And ever since then, our boat squeaks so much when we're offshore sailing that we wear earplugs inside. And so if we're going to do the knees, it means taking everything out from the galley to the head, all the way back down to the keel structure, and glassing it all back in properly. And if we're going to be doing that and fixing those squeaks, we may as well glass these bulkheads to the cabin top as well, fix those squeaks. So it's such a big project that we've just pushed it off and pushed it off and pushed it off for years, because we never really knew if we wanted to do it to this boat. And if we're going to be ripping out the cabin sole and the settees and reglassing all of this structure, the mast is coming out too, because we have to do work around the base of the mast. If the mast is coming out, we're replacing our rigging because it's almost been 10 years. There's a lot of welding work and conduit we want to put in the mast so that we can actually run more antennas and things up there, because the conduit we installed in Puerto Rico isn't big enough to run all the wires we need to run, including a NEMA wire for the masthead transducer, so we don't need to use the wireless one anymore. And if the mast is coming out, it means we can slack the rig, which means that the boat can kind of settle, if it's gonna settle, back into a bit more of a natural state if the rig's not tensioned. And since the rig is gonna be out, we can take the chain plates out. And if the chain plates come out, then we'll have to cut the deck out and replace the core, because the core is rotten here. And if we're replacing the core, it means repainting the deck. And after all that, we need to haul out, reinforce the dimples from the outside, fair the hull, and paint the hull before putting it all back together. And if we're gonna be repainting some of the deck, it means we'd repaint most of the deck, because when we were up in Norway, some water got underneath the Kiwi Gip and froze, which means there's these big sections on our boat that are missing non-skid now. And if the mast is coming off, it means the boom's coming off. And if the boom's coming off, we want to replace the end caps on our boom. And there's a bunch of other welding projects we need to do on the mast and on the boom. Things we just need to get fixed before we really take this boat in heavy weather sailing again. So all of that to say, it's not just a simple fix. It's not just fairing the dimples and painting the hull. And it's why we've been procrastinating doing this project for so long. In order to fix the dimples, we need to pull the mast, replace the core in the deck, rip everything out of the inside, down to the hull, reglass everything in, new water tanks, new nook, new cabinetry, reinforce the knees, reinforce the deck, glass the bulkheads, paint the deck, then haul out, reinforce the dimples from the outside, paint the hull, back in the water, put the mast back on, tighten everything back up. This is why we haven't done this project yet. It's huge, and we've never been in the right place at the right time with the right knowledge and the right skills and the right budget to pull it off. Which brings us to why we're here in Olbia. Italians love sailboats, and the sailing industry here in Italy is huge. And here in Olbia specifically, there are tons of shipyards and tons of chandleries and tons of carpenters and welders and like all of the people that can do this work all in one place. The problem is, this past week, we rented a car and we've been driving around to all the boat yards, asking about the projects we're trying to do, and the main question is how much we'll be able to do on our own. Because if we have to pay somebody to do all that work on our boat, it's just not gonna be worth it. But so far, every yard we visited has said no. As in, we're not allowed to do the work on our boat by ourselves. We don't know what to do. So that's the question that we've found ourselves trying to answer. Is doing all of this work worth it on a 50-year-old boat that was never designed to do with it what we've been doing with it? This is a coastal cruiser. It's a classic plastic. It was never designed to cross oceans, especially up into the North Pole and sail it the way that we sail it. So we've been pushing these projects off for a long time, not knowing whether or not we wanted to do them to this specific boat. And now that we're here in Olbia, and so far we're not having any luck finding a yard that will let us do the work ourselves, it's looking more and more like a project like this might not be worth it. And so we're still waiting on some quotes to come back, and we're still have some feelers out in different directions to try to figure out if there's other places we can do this work, or if there's other ways we can do this work. And yeah, right now we just don't really know. So I wish I had better news, but that's where we stand right now, and hopefully we'll know more next week. But until then, cheers.